The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk, the Bronx's flagship television talk show. Our phones are open tonight, so please join the dialogue by calling in at 718-960-7241. You can also email comments to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Well, revised test score standards by the state have wiped out gains city school children have made over the past several years. In fact, the city was shocked to find that this year more than half of city children failed the English exams and only 54% passed in math. But do these new numbers show that the city is doing a bad job at educating our children, or is it only that the scale we use to measure them has changed? In our studio is a professor of sociology and education at Columbia University's Teachers College. Good evening to Aaron Pallas. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
And also advocates for children's policy coordinator for older children, Christy Hill. Thank you for joining us at the last minute. We appreciate you coming in. And on the telephone and returning to BronxTalk, the foreman of timeout from testing, Jane Hirschman. Hello, Jane Hirschman. How are you? Do we have Jane? I don't hear her, but we'll get her a little bit later on. So let's start with you, Mr. Pallas. You had an editorial or a little op-ed piece in the Daily News recently. The flat numbers: more than 50% of the students didn't pass English, 54% passed in math. It wasn't too long ago that the city boasted that 2/3 were passing in English and 82% were passing in math. Did the city pull a fast one by either somehow scaling the test scores low? I mean, what's your impression of what happened here?
I would say that the state pulled a fast one, and that goes back several years because it's the state that's administering the tests that the city is using to try to hold schools accountable. And the evidence is that over time, the state tests were getting easier and more predictable, so that a kid did not have to get as many questions right to achieve a passing score. But a couple years ago, it became clear that there was a discrepancy between what was going on with the state tests and another test administered by the federal government called National Assessment for Educational Progress, or NAEP. And the NAEP tests showed flat scores for the state of New York and New York City for a number of years, whereas at the same time, the state numbers on the state's own test and the city on the state's test were skyrocketing. And that led to some question about what these state tests were actually measuring. So when the new commissioner, David Steiner, and the new chancellor of the Board of Regents, Meryl Tisch, came in, they asked some hard questions about whether the tests were really telling us what we thought they were about kids' performance. And recently they concluded that they weren't, that in fact what we thought was adequate performance really wasn't, that the scores that kids were getting were not predictive of kids doing well enough to get into college and avoid remediation.
You know, I don't know how political we want to get. In 2009, Mayor Bloomberg ran as the education mayor and talked glowingly about the students' progress in these tests. Do you think he was aware of this process that you had just been talking about, or was he just simply all too happy to talk about the numbers and move right along?
I think it was very easy for people across the state to see these rising scores and to be very pleased about that without looking too hard at it. And partly the blame for that lies with the federal legislation, No Child Left Behind, which forced all states to administer tests in grades 3 through 8 in English and math to every child every year, with the goal of having every child proficient by the year 2014, a very ambitious goal that no state can possibly meet. But when schools are not meeting that, there were some severe sanctions associated with it. So everyone felt comfortable seeing the scores going up and up without asking too many hard questions.
I want to bring our other guests in on the dialogue, but real quick, you're relieved now that you see, I mean, my sense from what you've described here is like finally we think we have a grasp on what really is going on. Are you relieved?
I am. I think that this is a more realistic appraisal of how well our kids are doing.
Let me move around the room. Ms. Hill, from Advocates for Children's point of view, how are the kids doing? I mean, test scores aside, are you concerned? Did you say, well, we knew this was really going on, or did you say this is somewhat of a surprise because we really did feel children are doing better than maybe in the past?
No, the clients that we're seeing and coming into our office are having trouble in school, are struggling. You see the achievement gap, as the scores show, has not decreased. And parents are upset because they believe that their kids were proficient, were doing better over the last few years, and just is not the case.
So did you suspect all along that maybe, gee whiz, something's amiss because there's a disconnect? The numbers seem to be going up, and yet I'm seeing parents and others coming in and saying, you know what, maybe the children aren't doing so well.
Well, there's a disconnect in the focus on testing exclusively in the school system and not trying to provide a well-rounded education for our students. Mm-hmm. And so, providing arts education, providing extended daytime, providing things that can help students do better in school so that they not only graduate high school, but are ready for life after high school.
These numbers have been used not only to measure children's achievement, but also to determine how well teachers, principals, and schools are doing.
Right.
Can I guess that you think now it's time to relook at that whole concept?
Definitely. We have schools closing and based on test scores that we now know are faulty, and communities are upset. And so I think that we do have to address how much weight we put on tests, especially when the scores don't mean that much.
I do want to mention to folks in the Bronx, if you want to weigh in, and it would be interesting to hear parents relay any stories that they have about their own children or their children's schools. We'd be happy to hear what you have to say. But let me move on to the telephone now. We didn't hear Jane Hirschman before. Is she with us now?
Yes, can you hear me,
Oh, there
Gary?
we go. Hi, Jane. How are you?
Good. Listen, I'm very, very concerned about what's happening in our city. Our children are being miseducated. And, Time Out from Testing has been saying for years that the test scores have been inflated, that the children are only getting a testing curriculum. And what concerns me right now is that Merrill Tisch, who's the chancellor of the Regents, and Steiner, the commissioner, are calling for harder tests, which is more of the same. The real problem is that a testing curriculum is not good education for our children. Because when you make tests harder, you're starting the whole cycle all over again, when teachers are going to be forced to teach to the test because graduation, promotion, tenure decisions, bonuses for principals and teachers, school grades are all based on this child's score. And what we need to return to is real reform. We need to really return to good education. How many books are the children reading? Do our children know how to think critically? Are they little scientists when they do science projects? They don't even teach science, art, and history anymore in grades 3 through 8 because it's not on the test.
Well, now, let me interject a question here, because you and I have had this dialogue over the years on this program.
Yes.
And in the past, you were, tilting at City Hall and maybe even the state, as Mr. Pallas has said. Now, the federal government is requiring these numbers and requiring these measures. So in order to have what you are suggesting become reality, you're now going into the Obama administration and Arne Duncan and all the people up there and asking them to change how they handle literally the entire evaluation system.
I certainly am. Because,
you didn't back down, did you?
Ran,
what a shock.
Michelle Obama said, if I was living under the Bush administration's testing policy, I would never be standing before you today. And Obama promised he was not going to continue this high-stakes testing policy. And actually, if you want to look at No Child Left Behind, as Aaron Pallas has said, it required assessment in math and English 3 through 8 and once in 10th grade. But it never said anything about high-stakes testing, where the single score determines all that I have just listed, nor did it test children in pre-K to 2. And Obama and the state of New York are talking about bringing tests for children as young as 4 and testing pre-K to 2, bringing this disastrous policy to younger children and making it harder for our children to get a good education.
All right, let me,
so yes, I am challenging the federal government as well, because I think the Obama administration actually has in place a testing policy and an education policy that's worse than the Bush administration.
Right.
And I never thought I was going to say that.
Let me bring it back to the folks in the room here. Evaluation of children. And in the history of this program, where we started out on our first show in 1994 talking education, has been a major issue. If not for testing, and we'll ask our education expert from Columbia's Teachers College, how can we evaluate children's progress so that teachers, we can assess how well teachers are doing, how well schools and principals are doing, and how well the system is doing, if not for a measure? Because what you hear back from the federal government, certainly when George Bush was president, and now even this president, is you got to have numbers. We got to have numbers, because if we don't have numbers, we don't know how we're doing. Give me a scheme that would work.
Well, I think we need a more differentiated accountability system, and I think that tests are a very small part of that. I don't want to say that tests are not useful at all, but they're primarily useful when used for diagnostic purposes, which is a really good way of thinking about how we assess what kids do know and what they need to know in ways that are more directly connected to what the teacher is doing in the classroom. The problem right now is that we have an accountability system, the school progress reports, which the Bloomberg and Klein administration are using to give letter grades to schools, and now using what's called value-added measures of student growth to evaluate teachers for tenure in ways that are decoupled from any genuine effort to improve what goes on in the classroom. We need to direct our attention to what's going on in the classroom, and simply ranking schools and teachers along these test score lines doesn't do that.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Hill, as our person on the ground, as it were, when you hear from teachers now, and I know we've tried many times to have teachers come in, but of course they're much less independent than they used to be, so they don't come on the show. What are they saying about it? Are they happy about the fact that, you know what, if I frankly teach to the test, I can get children in the class to learn a certain prescripted material, they can achieve, they can move on, I look good, the school looks good, I get, you know, they're now giving bonuses based on these things? Or are teachers saying, you know what, I don't like this kind of thing?
Well, most of our calls are coming from parents and students, but I think for teachers, what's going on is that they are being held accountable for teaching to the test, so that their options to do otherwise becomes more restricted in the classroom. And so changing the policies to allow for other things to go on in the classroom outside of focusing on tests becomes a necessity.
Mm-hmm. Special ed, charter schools all took a hit in this latest report about testing. Give me a recommendation what the city needs to do, because certainly the movement throughout the state has been charter schools, charter schools, charter schools. We did a show on that. Mm-hmm. Folks know that a couple of weeks ago. Mm-hmm. Does the city need to back off the notion of charter schools, or can they do better so they look better? Give me what the reaction of charter schools and even the special ed program has to be based on what we now know.
Right. I'm glad that you brought up special education students, because special education students and students that are English language learners are also part of this achievement gap that's going on that isn't talked about as much. In the case of students with disabilities, providing supports and services to them that allow for them to be in inclusive classrooms, allowing them access to charter schools and small schools where they are not in large numbers compared to their population in the city, allowing them to have access to a quality education and providing the necessary supports for them to be successful in those school programs.
Jane Hirschman, back to you then, as we literally go around the room. Tell me a little bit about how you see, I guess in essence, the same question that I asked before. How can we evaluate the schools, the teachers, the principals, as well as the children, so that all of the different ends can work and still make you and your colleagues at Time Out from Testing happy?
Well, I agree with everything that your guests have said, that tests have a place, but they shouldn't be the dominant place. And we have to get back. I mean, what this whole high-stakes testing movement has done has deprofessionalized teaching. Teaching is a profession. I'm not saying there aren't any rotten apples in this profession. Like all professions, there are rotten apples in them. But on the whole, we need to get back into the classroom. We need to include attendance records, tests, in-class tests, grades on projects, grades on research, the teacher recommendation. We have to get back to that. I mean, that is how I grew up. I went to a city public school, and I did well, and we didn't have high-stakes tests, and there was trust in the teacher. We had tests.
But many people say,
what gets children to learn, what motivates children, what kind of curriculum should we have that will turn children on to learning? Because I'll tell you, children, you go into schools and you just have to listen to them. They're totally sick and tired of drill and kill.
Jane,
it's
Jane,
really the children who have suffered for all of this.
Yeah, let me interject now. We talk about what we did maybe when we were in school. However, teachers were passed along who were not qualified to teach. There was an immense amount of waste that went through a Board of Education that was inefficient and corrupt, to use just a couple of words. So, do we want to go to those bad old days? And if we reinvigorate some of the things or reintegrate some of the things that Jane Hirschman is talking about, Aaron Palace, are we then going to open the can of worms once again and all of a sudden have a system without accountability?
I think it's a false choice to think that the only alternative is going back to the bad old days. I think that we can think more creatively about strategies for assessing teachers' performance in ways that look at students' achievement a little bit, but also look at what teachers are actually doing in the classroom, looking at teachers' practices. It's true that for a long time in New York City and elsewhere, the vast majority of teachers receive satisfactory evaluations, and you have to wonder about any system where 99% of the employees are getting fully satisfactory evaluations. And we had a system where it was very easy to get tenure. I personally favor extending the probationary period so that it takes a little bit longer to get tenure, so there's more of a chance to see how novice teachers are doing and to remedy any difficulties they may be having in the early parts of their career.
Are our friends in the UFT going to sit or stand for that kind of thing?
Well, that's a good question. I think that if it can be done in a way that allows them to believe that they are protecting tenure as a due process right, they'll be receptive to it. Certainly, they're going to be very aggressively opposing anything that would result in the loss of tenure.
Let's go to the telephones. Our buddy Mark from Pelham Parkway joins us. Hi, Mark. What's up?
Hey, Gary.
What's up?
Ladies, gentlemen. I'm not the biggest thing on education. I can make a few notices from my own days when I went to school and the run-ins I had with some teachers when my godson was going to school a couple of years back, who, by the way, is going to be a junior in Boston U on a full dime right now.
Well, there you go. My daughter at Boston University as well.
One of the problems I think I've noticed with the education system is that what you have going on now is, while the Board of Education was a failure and having a chancellor, you have two bean counters right now who are running your education system. Mayor Bloomberg is not an educator. He has no idea of education. He's a corporate businessman. The guy, Joel Klein, is a lawyer, I believe, from the music industry. So the logic has to go first and foremost. Where is your educators who should be educating and setting up curriculums that inspire kids to learn? Where you have dropout rates. This is proved right now with these test scores and everything that the education system in New York, while things were fudged, whoever you want to put the blame on, it's not what it is. Testing is important, but testing does not measure the knowledge of one. You can cram for a test, pass the test, and have no idea of what you've just passed and learned. If you want a good example of testing, look how many people are on the road that have a driver's license that you and I both know should not have a driver's license.
Mark, I get your point. We got what you were saying. Do you have a question, or you just wanted to make that?
Well, I think my question is, do they think, and you've got a gentleman from Columbia who's a professor, and Ms. Hirschhorn, I believe, that education should be put back in educators who really want to inspire children and people that are knowledgeable within their fields. I don't want an English teacher teaching science from a book who doesn't know the difference between UR 238 and 235 if you're teaching physics.
Thank you, Mark. Jane Hirschman has been on the show, and I can't see her right now, but I know she's jumping up and down going, I agree,
My
I agree,
reaction,
right?
Gary, I'm saying bravo to that caller because we have, running our school system right now, are non-educators, business people, and what they know is data and input and output. And our children are little widgets, and the teachers are the data collectors, and it has nothing to do with education. And we need to get back to bringing in educators into the system who know something about teaching and curriculum and assessment.
There you go. Let's go to the telephone and say hi to Bob from Riverdale. Hello, Bob. How are you?
How are you, Gary?
We're fine. I knew you would call tonight. You can't resist talking education, can you?
No, well, Gary, I hate to think that you think there's accountability in this administration when there is none. How much money is Bloomberg spend, or I should say Klein, spending on education? How many hundreds of millions of dollars did he save that he promised when he came into office? But I'm going to go to a presentation that the State Department of Education made about 8 years ago when I was on the Chancellor's Parent Advisory Council. And we have 4 levels that the children are graded on, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, with 1 being the lowest and 4 being the highest. The state wants children on level 3. That was the presentation to the Chancellor's Parent Advisory Council. And level 3 is 75 to 85%. They don't want anyone above 85, and they'd like not to have anybody below 75. They want all children to be at level 3. They don't want seniors. They don't want
Bob,
children
what's your
who
point here? What are you saying about that?
It's just that the testing was made to fit that plan. It was made to get children to the top level, meaning level 3, not level 4. And as far as the chancellor goes, you know I've been saying this for 7.5 years. He should resign or be fired.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bob, thank you very much. Christy Hill, from a political point of view, from a policy point of view, how do we make some of these changes happen? Parents, I mean, certainly in this forum, and I'm going to bring up somebody who disagrees very strongly, but in this forum, everybody seems to be on the same page saying we need to change. How does that happen? Can it happen under this mayor?
I think that it can, because it is at the state level. So talking to the folks in Albany at the state education department, talking to the regents who are making decisions right now about graduation reform and trying to change the requirements about how students are actually graduating from high school. Because we know now from these test scores that the scores not only are not accurate in predicting high school graduation, but that even if you graduate with a Regents diploma, you might not be able to stay on at CUNY. So we have a lot of work to do in the city.
A former DOE official named James Liebman and the Simon Rifkin professor of law at Columbia wrote an editorial in the Daily News. And I wanted to just share some of the things and lay out what another side of this argument is. And he says in his piece, the reforms Mayor Bloomberg put into place has boosted city student scores on state and national tests, narrowed the achievement gap between city students and their peers elsewhere in the state, and put more city kids on track to graduate college ready. The city's gains also show, and this is on what Mr. Pallas was talking about, on the National Assessment of Education Progress. Since Bloomberg took over the schools 8 years ago, the city's NAEP gains have outpaced the national average in 3 of 4 categories. This flies in the face of what everybody's saying, that, you know what, things are not going as well as we had thought. Your thoughts, Mr. Pallas?
Some of what he's saying is true. Unfortunately, a lot of it is not. And Mr. Liebman is an attorney, not an education researcher, although he did head the DOE's Office of Accountability for several years and is the architect of the school progress reports that assign letter grades to schools. So he has a vested interest in trying to defend test scores that are the basis of the system that he developed. The reality is that New York City is not doing any better than other large cities in terms of progress from 2003 to 2009. There has been absolutely no closure of the achievement gap between Black and Latino students on the one hand and white and Asian students on the other over that period. The city is not outstripping the nation. It has not been the kind of national leader that unfortunately Mayor Bloomberg and Chancellor Klein have proclaimed over and over again. The reality is there has been some slow progress over that period of time, and I don't want to deny that. but it has not been the miracle that both the chancellor and the mayor have said.
Christy Hill will give you the final word here, and will present it as advice for parents, because you have a wonderful helpline at Advocates for Children. Parents who may feel disenfranchised from the system do have at least somebody who will listen to them. So what's your message to parents tonight, especially if they're as concerned as some of you are about what's going on?
Stay involved in your child's education. Go to the school, meet with the teachers, ask for help for your students if they are struggling and falling behind, and feel free to call, Advocates for Children.
Call out the number so they will.
Can I say something too?
We'll get you in there, don't worry.
Great. Because I think this is.
Well, wait, Jane,
it's
hang on one second. We just want to
they
put this phone
need
number.
to change the
Hang on one sec. We just want to put this phone number up. So go ahead.
212-947-9779.
Okay. Now, Jane Hirschman, your perspective here as we wrap up?
I was saying we have to get parents to demand that there be a change of the conversation. We can't let Albany give us more and harder tests. That's more of the same. Our children deserve an education, and parents should go to timeoutfromtesting.org and join us. We'll be having a set of demands put up there in the next few days, and we're going to fight hard to make sure that we get rid of high-stakes tests and we bring in real education to our children.
Jane Hirschman, thanks for joining us from vacation, and your passion is appreciated. And Aaron Pallas will look for more commentary from you in the papers and elsewhere. Thank you for your time. Christy Hill, again at the last minute. We appreciate your joining us. And folks, if you have further comments or questions on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at BronxTalk@hotmail.com. And we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Archives of Bronx Talk are available at blip.tv. Just search for Bronx Talk. Next Monday night, also a show about how our children learn, but from a wholly different perspective, as we'll be joined by a Bronx comic book artist who will illustrate, yes, pun intended, illustrate how he works with Bronx children and how comic books can help them learn. That's next Monday evening for Bronx Talk, Monday nights at 9 here on BronxNet, Cablevision Channel 67, Verizon Fios 33. Special thanks to producer Jane Folloro, director Michael Arias, and our cast of thousands who are up there in the booth taking care of business. Good night.
Can you tell which of these children was not born free? Can you tell which of these children was not born equal? Can you tell which of these children does not deserve to be treated with dignity? We can't either. Human right number one. We are all born free and equal. What are human rights? Find out at youthforhumanrights.org.
Come on, let me get your wallet.